Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten, your host. Today we have back with us Adam Koontz from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Welcome back, Adam.
Good to be with you.
All right, so the last time we were on, we were talking about the battle for the Bible, and you had mentioned something about our juvenile response, and it was kind of brought up in conjunction with cartoonish portrayals and cartoon versions of things. And then further on, it was talking about just kind of immaturity versus being juvenile. You know,
yeah.
So if my 3-year-old acts like a 3-year-old, I expect that. But if my 7-year-old does, that's being juvenile, and that's then they're in sin.
Right.
So why do we have these juvenile responses? Where did our arrested development come from?
Where it came from is, I think, much harder to answer, at least concisely, than to say why we have them. That is, that there's a process of maturity that the Scriptures expect us to be engaged in as we, rooted and renewed in Christ, grow up into the fullness of Him. Mm-hmm. In whose image we have been remade, right? So the Christian life here is a progress, and it is therefore also a process of change. There's no coasting in the same sense that a child who's 15 is either done growing entirely, or he's always growing. Yeah. There are no other options, and since we are not complete in that process, this side of glory, the option is to continue growing, and I think that got caricatured, especially recently. I mean, I want to say that for people our age, they have the same sort of allergy to, quote, American evangelicalism that people in the two previous and probably more than that generations in the Lutheran Church had to Roman Catholicism. And there was always a degree of irrationality and incapacity to recognize common things, on the one hand with Roman Catholics and on the other with evangelicals. And I think that has made us maybe allergic to discussion of some of these issues, what Christian maturity is, how it might be attained, how humility relates to that. And that has really not helped us, because it means that discussion of things pertinent to my life and the decisions I'm making and the wisdom or lack of wisdom in those decisions is not really available to me, right? I can talk about what vestments I am or am not using for certain Sundays in Advent and Lent. And that's totally fine. It just has proved to be, it's proved to be a little insufficient.
Yeah, it has its place.
Yeah.
In and among other things, assuming the other things are also present.
Right. Yeah. And that assumption is something that I think was there, like it's there in some of the stuff that has gone wrong with our preaching that we have talked about, that I and others have written about, a presumption of functionality. People, they already know the law, or they already beat themselves up and things like that. And, maybe that was true. I honestly have no idea. I wasn't there, but because these are pastoral realities, right? These are on the ground realities. They're not just abstractions. Abstractly, we've kept the same theological assertions. The issue is none of that is there on the ground anymore. If they're beating themselves up, it's because they have such a deep conflict, like we discussed, between what's required of them at work and what the pastor says on Sunday, and then no one ever resolves that or helps them with that conflict, and the pastor doesn't address it. He just assumes they know that abortion is wrong, or he assumes they know that there are only two genders or something. Like, most of the stuff we cover very offhandedly. So
Yeah.
that all of that stunts the growth. Yeah.
Okay. So it's really a lack of having spiritual fathers in the pulpit and around them, and then even fellow brothers that
Yeah.
help to inculcate that life which we would normally have within a family. Like in a family, you have a dad, but then you also have the older siblings who helped the younger siblings to become accommodated to how the family works. And so it seems as though we have like this two-pronged issue where you're not getting kind of prescriptive direction from the father, nor are you getting the come along help from the brothers and sisters and the rest of the family.
Yeah. No, that's totally right. And this has to do with both the utter absence of fathers, right? But also with a sort of absentee landlordism in families and also in churches. And what I mean by that is, you actually do own the property, but you just never visit and you don't look after it. And that I find to be far more common among our people than sheer absence by virtue of divorce or separation or death or something, is that absentee landlordism is much more common. So the pastor knows, for example, that the Bible knowledge of the confirmants has declined over his career, but he feels unable to search out the source of that or to remedy it, and so he just sort of accepts it. Or the father notices that the kids are behaving weirdly the past couple of years, and especially since they got phones, but they need phones so that they can call in case they ever get lost at the middle school they go to every day. I don't know. And then they can get picked up. So they have these phones, and then they're always on the phones. And now, their hair is a color not found in nature. And they have opinions that he didn't know they had. So this is a sort of, I never go over to the property, and the house is kind of falling into the ground and the grass is really long, but I'm also not doing anything about it. I guess I figure somebody's going to cut the grass and fix the house up. So this is, I think, vastly more common in our circles than, sheer and utter absence. It's just not that common in church-going families. I'm sure it's more common than it was 20 years ago, but I think that absentee landlordism is far more common. All the components are there, and there isn't an ordained woman in the pulpit or something, but somehow that doesn't matter. You're getting basically the same results.
Yeah.
So that makes you wonder, okay, well, what are we doing in common with those denominations that in the 1970s and the 1960s and the whatever, when they had a confrontation about the Bible, how did we wind up with roughly many of the same results in our own people that they did? Because on paper, we kept so much that was good, or we fixed so much that was bad.
Well, yeah, that's the question. How did that happen? I mean, so if we've just become slumlords, and as you said, absentee landlordism, is it just because we're just lazy? That is a part of it, of course.
Yeah, I am reluctant to. I'm reluctant to say, okay, here's the one cause.
Yeah,
because when you get these situations of widespread iniquity and decay, let's say in Israel, they never have one cause. They have a single root in idolatry, and then that gets worked out differently between the priests of the nation and the shepherds, which is also governmental leaders in the Old Testament. And so the varieties of iniquity having their one root in idolatry mean that it's hard to say, okay, we should have, like, if we had gone back to, this committee report in 1973, or we went back and we did this, or this guy didn't get hired to teach at St. Louis or something, that it would have been fixed, because the nature of spiritual decay, but also of renewal, relies on God's action. And when you see these things occurring in Israel, your first faithful reaction is to pray for God's rescue from these things, because you recognize that the realities are far bigger than any one person or even church or church body could deal with, right? Because this is a sort of malaise and destruction. I mean, if you just look at many of the symptoms of modern American life, they line up extremely well with Israel as denounced by the prophets. So these are things where, the first reaction that I have is to commend them into God's hands, because I know that I can't say, well, if the pastors just stop being lazy. Now, are many of the pastors lazy? Is this a problem that we have as a class of people? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sure is. Yeah. But it's one among many. And I don't say that to be evasive. I say that because I think true. the nature of the problem is so enormous.
All right. So you said that, in ancient Israel, the various classes, the people, the shepherds, the priests, that all has its root in idolatry. Is that a specific kind of idol? Is it, and so then if it is, or whatever that spectrum might be, in what way are those similar idols being worshipped by our classes of people, so to speak?
Yeah. You have a multiplicity of idols. Idolatry is always tolerant in that way, because there is no jealous God who has his monogamous love for his people that our God does. So there's always going to be multiplicity. It's why I don't get stressed out, let's say, by dissension or disagreement in the church when on paper we're all supposed to be on the same page. And that's not because dissension and disagreement are good, right? I'm not applauding them. I'm simply unsurprised by them in a situation where idolatry with attendant, especially apathy about one another, and we've talked about that, is so common. Mm-hmm. So when I say idolatry for modern Americans, I think maybe I talked about this when we had the conference down in Illinois in the fall, but I think of idolatry for modern Americans more in terms of time than of space. So in the ancient world, idolatry is a spatially visible reality. I can go around the city, especially, but also around the countryside, and it is full of idols, right? This is Paul's experience when he comes into Athens. I see you are very religious. And that idea that people are very religious is not, I think, I don't think that's actually changed. I think human beings need to fear things. Obviously, we've seen that. Yeah. They need to love things. They need to hate things that are therefore wicked because they're the opposite of what they love. And obviously, they need to trust. And that's why, I think that's what's clever about Luther's understanding of idolatry in the Large Catechism. So I think of the idols that we have not in terms so much of space. One thing that's spatially visible is that if you see a cityscape, until the late 19th century, it's always dominated by churches. And now our cityscapes, if the city is of any account, are dominated by office buildings. So there's that. That's a spatially visible reality. What dominates the city is the making of money rather than the worship of God. But generally, these things I think are visible in people's schedules more than in their architecture or their geography. So what do they actually spend their time doing? What a lot of people spend their time doing when they're not working is passively consuming things that are momentarily pleasurable. So that's what they're into, and then those things control them. So pornography controls them, and shopping controls them, and debt controls them, and so all of that makes sense if you start thinking in terms of idolatry as measured by time rather than space. And that's gotten me a lot farther in understanding things than trying to figure out, okay, well, look how the NFL is like a church, and blah, blah, blah. And it's actually kind of an unflattering comparison because people invest so much more. And cities invest in football stadiums in a way that they don't in churches. So it's kind of like, well, no, these things aren't really comparable because one obviously matters a lot more than the other. So when I think about it in terms of time, it makes more sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, this became clear when the people of God were more upset that they stopped using the national anthem at these things than when they scheduled them on Sundays.
Yeah, and I mean, Lutherans were there's kind of a perfect storm for Lutherans that I think, and this gets into some of the historical complexities that have gotten us here. But there's a perfect storm here that has made us particularly susceptible to things that usually don't go away so quickly in denominations that have such conservative theology on the books as we do. So one of those things is that we felt, because we were an immigrant, or up until maybe the 1950s, the children of immigrants church body, we felt relatively little investment in the fortunes of American life. It didn't matter. We were somewhat disconnected. We had our own enclaves and lived in them by ourselves. And then when we tried to go mainstream, we went mainstream with other Lutherans, right? So that's why the mid-century push is a Lutheran unity push overwhelmingly. It's not a generic push for Christian unity of some kind, such as both fundamentalists and modernists had. I mean, there was Carl McIntyre founded a kind of fundamentalist counterpart to the National Council of Churches. We weren't really involved in any of that. We were trying to get together with other Lutherans. So there's that. So we're kind of cut off. And then when we're no longer cut off, because we really are kind of American born of Americans, we have this certain theological assertions that are fine on the books, right? So you're free to, I don't know, do, whatever, play baseball on Sunday afternoon or something, I guess, if you want to. Lutherans are not going to support, blue laws the way they historically exist in America. And that's fine, right? The problem is that's not really that there is some spiritual insight about the allotment of time that, because they have a different idea about what Sunday is for, evangelicals had, that caused them to push back against these things when Sunday was more sacrosanct in American life. And now it's not sacrosanct at all, except for certain sporting events. And even more than that, if our people don't have the right kind of job, they are constantly torn between making a living and going to church. Mm-hmm. And, there's only so much that, a Monday service or a Thursday service or a year-round Wednesday service can do, because that person never quite belongs to the congregation in the same way that somebody who, went to college and is salaried, so doesn't have to work on the weekends, got, right? And we kind of slammed into this world with these really concrete challenges long before, diversity training and stuff like we talked about before. Long before that, we came into this world kind of riding the coattails of a society that was operating by different theological rules, but therefore Sunday was sacrosanct, and even Wednesday was kind of sacrosanct. And we built a lot within that framework, even though we didn't particularly have a reason for supporting it. And then it disappeared. And we didn't really have anything to replace it. I mean, the things that I worry about, or the things that I think about, let's say, are not so much, are there going to be people who are affirming that baptism is regenerative? Yes, there will be those people. And that's wonderful. I worry that those people who believe that baptism regenerates and the Lord's Supper is truly the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, and all the other sort of basic Lutheran assertions that our people know, I worry that they're going to have places to go to church that don't close on the whim of the government, and that those places will care for them practically. We'll make sure that they're able to go to church. We'll make sure that they're able to educate their children. These are the things that I think about, and that I think a lot of that, those sort of components of everyday life that make church possible, that was on autopilot, maybe along with, quote, the knowledge of the law, and we just assumed it was all going to be there, and now it's obviously not.
So is that part of our being juvenile? I mean, does that immaturity, is that manifested in that assumption, or the assumption that it's going to be there, or we haven't even thought through what needs, once the thing is swept clean, what we're going to be replacing it with?
Yep. Yeah. Because it's kind of like being like 14 or 15, and you definitely, if you do work, you're not driving yourself to work yet. So you don't think much about how much that costs, or how much a car costs, or what insurance costs. And you're 14 or 15, so you've had plenty of time to figure out your parents' flaws, right? And so, but, you don't have kids. You don't have much of a job, probably. You haven't accepted the same burdens and responsibilities and cares that your parents have. And you're not tasked with raising teenagers like your parents are at that moment when you're 14 or 15. And so there is something about a 14 or 15-year-old which is very sharp and very observant generally. But their juvenility is when they don't realize how hard life can be, and therefore they don't have the humility and the love that mature people manifest for each other, because they understand the cost of things. And so I think on a macro level, that has been very often the Lutheran Church in the United States. Is we had a lot, and no, it wasn't perfect. America was not a perfect place. No one's claiming that, but it was pretty good, and we benefited richly from it. And now a lot of those things are going away, even before we ever maybe participated in any kind of way proportionate to our numbers, even in relatively heavily Lutheran Midwestern congressional districts, states, et cetera. You're kind of hard pressed to find a Lutheran engaged in public life, and going to church every Sunday. So, your exceptions being rather horrendous liberals like Paul Simon. So, in the case of Illinois, so.
No, well, we had Shimkus here too.
Yeah,
recently. Right. But the point still stands. Whenever we find a Lutheran who has somehow made it big, everyone just starts rah-rahing like, "Oh wow, we finally have one." It's a surprise to us. It's not a standard procedure anymore. We don't expect it. Right.
Yeah, and if you think about a church that on the books has fewer people than we do, and I'm sure has many fewer attendees on a given Sunday than we do, which is the Episcopal Church. They have tons of people involved in public life at any given time on a national level, way out of proportion to their numbers. So this is just the idea that if you live here, you will bear the burden of the welfare of the city. And on a macro level, and we can also talk about a micro level about being juvenile, but on a macro level, that means that when things work adversely, or when people don't know anything about you, or they don't know what a Lutheran is, or they don't know why you would object to this or that, or there are things that could be Lutheran issues that I've never even heard anyone talk about, such as, can we get a form of conscientious objection that recognizes our just war theory of war, rather than just you have to affirm to the government that you're just a pacifist, which we can't do theologically. So those kinds of things would be amazing, but they require an acceptance of responsibility, of being, in the Teddy Roosevelt phrase, the man in the arena. So so you have to do that. And if you don't do that, you really should not be surprised if no one knows about you and no one cares and nothing is really set up to actually help your kind not only survive, but also thrive.
Yeah, I'd like to explore this a little bit more because we were talking about just being juvenile, and how we are inheritors of a great amount of goodness from our forefathers. And yet it seems as though we are hell-bent at blaming them for all of the bad on the one hand, and not recognizing the good. So that's a certain, there's sin there. But then on top of that, you mentioned responsibility, that even if it is not our fault for where we're currently at, which I'm not necessarily willing to cede at this point, but even if it isn't our fault, that doesn't necessitate we have no responsibility moving forward. And that seems to go along with this immaturity or this arrested development that we're seeing, that we simply want to blame and not take any responsibility moving forward. And so we just languish.
Right.
So talk about that for a little bit more, and then perhaps try to provide a framework for us to understand how to move forward out of that really kind of nihilistic thinking.
Sure. Yeah, because I think you have to ponder that if you met two guys that were, young guys, and you had a young daughter, and you were looking for someone to marry her to, the guy who has been really given quite a bit in life, but is complaining to you about how his dad was unfair, and his dad was this, and his dad was that, and his dad was, not, supportive as he should have been. And his mother harped on him and everything like that, that he may have said nothing that was actually false in such a conversation.
Right.
That really doesn't matter. You talk to the other guy, and he has had, in many ways, an objectively more difficult upbringing, but does not tell you about the failings of his parents. If he talks about his parents, he is laudatory, or, maybe in an effort not to lie, he's a little restrained in his praise of them, which is fine. But he is telling you about what he's getting into, or what he's doing with his life, or whatever. And think about the fact that the latter young man is immediately more attractive to everybody, because he is focused on what can be built rather than what he will be able to tear down.
Yeah.
And none of that has anything to do with the financial advantages or disadvantages, inherited or not, by either of those young men. So when we're thinking about the past, it's always a juvenile attitude to obsess over the failings of one's fathers. It's also easy. It's like the numerous groups, political, religious, and otherwise, in modern America that apologize for or repent of things that allegedly their ancestors did to various other groups or people or whatever.
Sure.
And that attitude is so easy because it's not actually repentance. Repentance is always, in some measure, painful, because it takes something from you, maybe something actually that you have been cherishing in your in your flesh. You like it that way. You like the sense of self-regard and self-righteousness that you get when you denounce your father to your wife, and his failings and his, whatever it is that he failed to be, that you're not going to fail to be. So that attitude is always juvenile. If what you are doing or saying could be done or said easily by a completely unremarkable 14-year-old, you're probably being juvenile.
Yeah. It's like that Mark Twain quote, when I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could barely stand to be around the old man. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much he'd learned in 7 years.
I know. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, precisely. Right. And that attitude, I mean, I don't personally remember being wildly rebellious against my parents or something. This is not really the same thing. To say that something is juvenile is not the same thing as the relatively recent idea that teenagers have to rebel openly or clearly. I'm sure that has always happened for some, percentage of, people growing up, but this is something a lot more natural and more widespread than rebellion. This is the juvenile recognition that your parents are not infallible like you thought when you were 8, and that you may or may not know better how to do something or how to be someone. And so it is in its own way an unfortunate necessity in human development. It is not a place to stop. And I fear that in many ways, on a macro level, but also on a micro level, where I'll find pastors relating to each other in ways that, by their own account, their most difficult parishioners relate to them. So just kind of harping and complaining and even anonymously complaining. And it's like, well, so on Sunday, they come up to you and say, Pastor, people are saying, and then on Monday, you get on the internet and say, this is not the way we ought to be. Okay, well, that's fine. You might be right. The people who are saying things on Sunday might actually be right. Yeah. What is anyone going to do about it? Right? What is anyone going to actually change about it? Because to complain or to talk without the acceptance of responsibility, without desiring to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, that is the way that Christ himself behaves, that's juvenile. So you have to accept responsibility in order to escape being juvenile.
Now, where's the disconnect? Because oftentimes you hear in the scenario that you just presented about, the parishioner who comes up to you and say, people are saying, or then the pastor immediately turning around, this is not how one, ought to conduct himself. How they will kind of defend themselves by saying, well, this is a public matter, so we need to just speak publicly instead of...
Yeah.
So where is the disconnect in their thinking? Where they think they're taking responsibility, but they're actually not.
Right. Yeah, because I too lament the way that the 8th commandment has become for almost the only commandment that ever gets mentioned in public or ever discussed as to its violation. Because it's obviously connected to the other commandments and especially to the first. And so that has to be explained. And there are always other things at play in any problem in the church. There are personalities and all the rest of it. The disconnect there between I've spotted it and I've talked about it, and the difference between that and necessarily taking responsibility is that, let's say the person comes up and says, Pastor, people are saying, and you just call their bluff. You say, is this your wife, Bob? Why is your wife upset about this? You just, because it's probably Bob's wife or it's Bob's best friend's wife.
Yeah.
People are saying. And so if Bob wants to accept responsibility at that point, that means that he's going to be open about it. And then I get to analyze the situation in its fullness. And this goes back to the disconnect goes back to something that we talked about, I think, last time, which is the denigration of practice. Yeah. As if when everything's there on the books, the practice will just happen and it'll be good. And that is not, the New Testament focuses incessantly on things that appear minuscule to us, like how people are eating meals or failing to together in the congregation, or whether they understand the way that the service is supposed to go, or whether two women who are fighting with each other have actually been reconciled. I have often wondered if Euodia and Syntyche are pretending everything is okay when Paul writes about them and, makes them immortal in their strife. So that attention to practice is an attention to the fact that the church is a gathering of human beings who have to be shaped and changed as entire human beings with their emotions and their hangups and their, refusal to talk to each other. And when you think about it that way, responsibility always involves both responsibility for the issue at hand. Okay. And this is true. I mean, pastors understand this, I think, too, because whenever there is a problem, it is both theological and human. There may be a total absence of theological awareness. The person has no idea that Holy Communion is only for those under the authority of an Orthodox pastor. I mean, that we can't share communion with just anybody. They've just never even heard it. It could be that they simply need to be taught. It could be that they've been taught that and they don't like it for any variety of reasons, most of which are probably not purely intellectual. It could be that they've been taught it, they used to think it, and then their child left the communion. And so now they have changed their mind simply because of the power of family ties. All of those things are taken into account when you deal with people, such that your explanation of why you are practicing closed communion is not utterly verbally identical to somebody who's never been instructed, to somebody who doesn't really understand how it works, and to somebody whose child has recently left the church. So when we're dealing with any issue, if I spot that something is wrong, and this is especially easy with the internet because I can go find not just anybody's bulletin practically, but practically the entirety of anyone's service, depending on the congregation, anywhere in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod any given Sunday. And because I can do that, I could, if I wanted to, and if I maybe programmed some kind of bot well enough, well, obviously I wouldn't do that. I can barely use a telephone, but if I got somebody who could do that, then I could send in complaints to church offices and district presidents and the synod president. I could bombard President Harrison every Sunday with, look what's going wrong here.
We're actually developing that bot at Cotta States.
Outstanding. Yeah. And it could be as minutely focused as I wanted it to. So I could say, I don't, and it could be as suspicious as I wanted it to. I could say, well, his statement looked really good in his bulletin about communion, but I didn't see him stop and talk to anybody. So I don't know, I don't know if he's really, and I didn't see the ushers talk to anybody. So, and it's not that maybe I'm right. Maybe I'm factually correct. And it's a really great statement in the bulletin, and it's never been changed for 17 years. And he's never asked anyone in 17 years. And he just kind of doing that. Maybe that's all true.
Yeah.
The other question is, am I going to bear any responsibility for that brother? In a human way? Am I willing to even call him on the phone, let alone talk to him? And this isn't to say, I'm not saying like then you're just wrong and you're breaking the 8th commandment and you need to shut up. I'm saying that there is a context for Christian life in the New Testament that especially involves the local congregation that we often skip right over. And I think that, like functional families, we take functional local churches for granted.
Yeah.
And their processes and their existence, and we leave it up to apathy, such that maybe the guy who's fighting all these battles on the internet is identifying real problems that the guys in the circuit next to that pastor who's been there for 17 years might know are there, but don't care about, or themselves do the same thing or whatever. But I think the disconnect is just a measure of apathy, because when you actually love somebody, the distance between I want you to do the right thing, or I want you to live in a way that is not self-destructive, and then what is going to be asked of me in order to achieve that goal, I don't care what that distance is. Right? If I love you, I do not care what the distance is. You are, you're my wife, you're my child, and you have some sort of horrible form of cancer. I will be with you every second that I need to be, and we will go wherever, and I will spend all of my savings and more to heal you if that's what is necessary. Right? So love doesn't ask about cost, nor does it, I think, reckon with cost in this kind of, very kind of bureaucratic way beforehand. The disconnect is because we know what ought to be done. But if love is absent, obviously a certain kind of an apathy will be there, right? I don't really care what this guy does because I don't care. I care on the sense, he's violating basically company policy, and he maybe is, but on a certain level, I don't care about that. So I'm not going to take that step.
Yeah. And this is so love is required in order for this to even begin to work. Why are we so juvenile in our love? I mean, maybe you don't like that question. But why is there such a stunted growth? In our ability to love, because it seems like everything is couched in, that's not how I would say it. That's not how I would do it. And we want,
right. As if that's important, if it's obviously important how you would do it, And
to a certain extent, I get there's different styles. There's a spectrum within which all of these things can survive and thrive, right? All of our doctrinal positions. I totally get that.
Sure.
But why? I mean, this just kind of makes me upset, angry. Why don't we just love each other? I mean, and not in the silly, saccharine way, but actually
where you forget that any of that stuff is even happening, right?
Yeah.
So love is defined as the opposite of caring about doctrine, for example. Love is the opposite of caring about practice. Love is the opposite of actually wanting people to be confessionally Lutheran rather than Lutheran in name or Lutheran by ethnicity or whatever, right? Love is couched, or in vocationally specific terms for us, pastoral is couched as the opposite of caring about doctrine or practice. Mm-hmm. And I did not really understand this until I began to read both things by and also things about early Missouri Synod people, not necessarily historically well-known or even particularly significant in any widespread way, people who made really enormous sacrifices. And you always ask yourself, why would they do that?
Yeah.
Why were they like that? And the thing that you find is a certain burning concern for souls and for each other and for the way that each other is living that is not like we are, where we complain, but the salary still gets paid, or we, have this gripe about the synod, but we're still in Concordia plan, or whatever the case may be. And that to me simply seemed not only like a more commendable way of living, but more noble, more honorable. So I thought, well, I mean, of all things, right? Because I didn't have to be here. I mean, I wasn't raised here. I chose this. I don't want to be petty, Of all things, I fear waking up one day and realizing that whatever I have achieved, it is of almost no significance.
Yeah.
That I have become, a certain kind of a commonplace footnote within an academic subdiscipline, or that I have made some substantial amount of money that the government will take 40% of when I die, and my children may, spend wastefully like the younger son or something. I mean, all of that really doesn't matter very much finally. So I want to live in a way that is magnanimous and great-hearted, and has, as much as I possibly can, imbibe from Scripture, the mind and the heart of God. And I find that he is not one who, complains about Israel and then remains far off. So, I mean, Jeremiah, I think, gets a very bad reputation, partly because people don't read it. I mean, it's so long, they don't know what's in there. And the historical references are sometimes obscure. Jeremiah gets a bad reputation as just miserable, but constantly there is a pattern of indictment on both doctrine and practice. Okay. Sometimes more one than the other, but doctrine and practice, indictment by the Lord, and also the statement that he will come to help, that he will give them a new heart, that he will cut a new covenant with them, that his covenant of peace shall never be shattered. These are things that he says over and over. So he doesn't stand far off. So, I mean, if I am growing into the fullness of him, right, into whom I have been baptized, then there's no place for me to complain or or just to say, why doesn't this change? Or why doesn't someone do something about this? Or I have to, as much as is within me, pursue things that might be difficult, but are worthwhile because they are reflective of love.
Okay. So with the time remaining, I'd kind of like to, how would you say this to someone your own age, someone older than you, and then someone younger than you? All right. So how would you say what next steps are, taking into consideration our arrested development in love, in faith, in fear of the right things, and in hating the right things? How would you say that to the various kinds of people who are either older than you, same age, or younger, so that we can begin to at least mentally and then physically take the next steps to counteracting the malaise that you had talked about earlier and actually grow up into Christ and become mature?
Right. To someone older, we have to be permitted to talk about what is occurring and not only about certain issues that are well worn, where the lines are already well drawn. But we also have to be able to talk about those things, like we mentioned with reactions to COVID, where the lines did not fall predictably along the same, let's say, politico-theological lines that we had for the past 20 or 30 years. So we have to be able to talk about things that are, quote, in the realm of the law or concern the orders of creation that do impinge on daily life, that do have to do with how men and women respectively order their lives. And those things have often been off the table because they're difficult and because it was easier not to talk about them. And the government wasn't forbidding us to preach justification by faith, and it wasn't mainstreaming medieval Roman Catholicism. It was mainstreaming transgenderism. So those kinds of things have to be discussed. They are the front lines. Most ideas about mankind that our children imbibe culturally and educationally are not only off, but destructively off. So those things have to be discussed. For my own generation, a disgust at not only your forebearers in an abstract, sepia-tinted sense, but also the boomers. That is really finally a juvenile attitude. Even when you're right, it's juvenile. So that attitude toward your forebearers, the people who made sure that these things continue to exist such that you get to have them too, to whatever degree, is out of place. And you're not going to get anything done while you are ranting about what is wrong with other people. That's not how you build things. You can't build anything by complaining about the buildings that other people build. So even if you do have to notice where and when they did something wrong. To people younger, patience is absolutely necessary. And that's something that it's always a vice of the young to be impatient. It's particularly a vice of the young, but it is especially a vice of the young who have relatively little day-to-day acquaintance with having to wait for things or running up against hard realities that now are maybe confined to when you play a team sport and you're just stronger than another guy or you're just slower than another guy. But a lot of people under a certain age do not run up against hard physical realities often enough and are told that those are unreal and live very often large portions of their day on the internet. And that makes the acquaintance with hard realities and also with how people are and what people are capable of, all of that unreal or unknown. So patience, especially for the young, which is always necessary, but especially necessary now, partly too because even people my age, let alone people older than I am, did not handle the same levels of dysfunction that you, the young, have lived with as long as you've been aware of life. So you have to wait for people to figure things out because they don't flip their opinions as quickly as you have learned to from the internet. And they also have not experienced some of the horrors that you have. You know, a 50-year-old didn't grow up with access to a wide array of free pornography. Right. So he didn't face basically demons screaming in his face every day in the same way. So you have to understand that. And so that mutual understanding, which is always a mark of maturity, will be confident however old you are. This is where Paul says things that I don't hear people talk too much about, but he's confident, for example, that various congregations will realize that what he's saying is right, and the Lord will give them, understanding in these things. So I mean, it's kind of funny, but he believes that there's a process of growth that occurs in God's people as they hear his word, and he's confident that that is occurring. Yeah. So there isn't reason for alarm or shock or horror or rage on Paul's part, and he doesn't display it. When with a normal congregation, there is simply dysfunction, a lack of awareness, whatever the problem may be. Paul is only extremely stern with people when the gospel, strictly speaking, is on the line, as in Galatians. Even with the Corinthians, with all of their mess, equivalent in some ways to many of our congregations because of the social and sexual lives that they have been taught by the media, not the Bible, to lead.
Yeah.
Paul addresses them as saints and is confident that his God will supply them with the Spirit to give them this understanding that they need.
So it sounds like there's a certain level of self-examination that goes along with this as well. Just in terms of taking heed unto yourselves, as Paul says to the folks in Ephesus, or watching yourselves, our Lord says, when you see these signs coming upon us,
right?
That we would submit ourselves to God's plan, or at least what He has said, and then trust that He will bring it about, and that we should continue to be faithful in what He has actually placed us in those specific times and places to do, and in those particular interactions. I mean, is that fair?
Yeah, and I would add,
it's a little abstract, but
no, I think it's good, and I would add to it that the shape that faithfulness takes when the church is especially threatened is less of the harshness with one another inside of the church that was a luxury afforded to us by the immense prosperity and peace of the past 60 years in the United States. That I can be very harsh with you for whatever issue that is not destructive of Christian fellowship, but is deeply irritating to me. I can be harsh with you if nothing else is on the line. So, we can scream at each other about whether you moved your ball when we were playing golf in an otherwise irrelevant game, because I have nothing better to worry about on a Saturday afternoon. If the stakes are higher, and we're talking about survival, we're talking about making sure that my confirmands are all the same sex when they get out of high school that they were when I confirmed them. If we're talking about, obviously they are biologically, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The way they're presenting. If we're talking about whether the congregation is going to exist, or whether there are going to be more congregations or there are going to be fewer, and we're just going to kind of sit down and take that, let that happen, then the stakes are different. And I simply do not and cannot and won't muster the rage at one another over very specific issues that was customary in the past. Therefore, I also, and we've talked about this as well, I also just don't really even understand. I just don't really understand, it's like, well, I'm Missouri Synod Lutheran, but I'm not really into that, like communion thing. Like, it's not a big deal. And It doesn't matter who takes it really, or, I don't really need church practices reflective of the fact that the God of the universe is physically present in this space on Sunday morning, So those kinds of, I don't really understand that anymore. That to me also seems like a luxury, a kind of Lutheranism that is not particularly itself. Why? That to me, that is like carrying, when the pioneers go west, there's all this stuff that they dump along the accustomed trails, so at some point back in like Ohio, somebody's like, well, let's bring the piano. And then by Western Nebraska, they're like, I guess we don't need the piano because
they burn
it. They burn it. Right. We're trying to get to California. We don't need the piano. There are lots of this is convicting. There are lots of books dumped by the sides of, the California and the Oregon trails. So you realize along the way what is actually needful. And it's confusing to me that you would be both very harsh with people that you're surviving with, or that people would be in the group and they'd be like, well, we're in the middle of Nevada. There's not really water, but I'm still making my oxen pull this piano across the desert, even though they're dying of thirst. So these kinds of things all get very concrete, right? So what you said, it was a little abstract, but it's easy to make it concrete in our situations because life is forcing concreteness upon us, which is great.
Last thing, it seems as though we aren't welcoming that. Is that also we're not welcoming that as great and clarifying? Is that another sign of our arrested development?
The attitude that is reactionary, is juvenile, because you are not able, when you're 14, to think enough about other people, except maybe other people of the opposite sex. You're not able to think enough from your parents' perspective about why they might be saying something. You're able to laugh at other people, and maybe you're right too. They're funny, they're weird, they're quirky, and you're able to spot what is wrong with other people. The acceptance of adversity as opportunity is a mark of enormous growth. And when that is accepted in some realm of a Christian's life, whether it is in prayer or in some other Christian discipline, whether it is theologically, when a person accepts that no matter what I was taught when I was 10, I'm going to figure out what exactly this teaching of Scripture means and why it's important. And that has led many people into the Lutheran Church. Those processes of growth are when you accept that something is hard to deal with, something is going to cost you something, but you're going to go through with it nonetheless. That you can do anything with people like that. You don't even need them to know beforehand all the stuff about, my favorite doctrine, the election of grace. I wish more people knew about that, because they would believe a lot more in providence, and then they would simply be happier in life,
right?
Because they would know God as a lively and loving Father. But if they don't know that yet, that's okay. If they're simply willing to accept some amount of pain and not complain about it and say, oh, why is this happening? Why is it hard? Well, that's just the way it is. and if you accept that and you choose to grow in the way that it is, rather than complain about the way that it is, amazing things could happen. So, honestly, Jason, I'm pretty optimistic, and some of that is just a character flaw, but some of that too is the knowledge that God uses things like the past 2 years, but also whatever the next 2 years bring, as refinement. And that's always a good process, and it's painful, but it's always good.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for your time. I know we're up against the hour.
Yes, sir.
So look forward to having you on again to get into those other things that you brought up that I said I was setting you up for.
Yeah, that'd be great. Sounds good.
All right. Take care.
Bye now.